Hi, I'm Janine Bailey, and tonight I'm going to be talking about E.F. Hutton, the financial group, and how they fell from grace back in the 80s. In the 1980s, the slogan for the financial giant E.F. Hutton's advertising campaign was, "When E.F. talks, people listen." This commercial that you see here on the screen shows a bunch of people on a plane talking about their finances. And when this gentleman on the right says, "Well, my broker is E.F. Hutton," everybody leans in because they want to hear what he has to say. Well, unfortunately, E.F. Hutton went from being a revered mainstay of Wall Street to a cautionary tale for its industry peers when it was discovered back in 1985 that they had knowingly engaged in a check kiting scheme and had defrauded other financial institutions out of millions of dollars. So let's talk about a little bit how that happened. So check kiting is a practice where they basically float funds. They have a check that they write to one institution to put some funds in the bank, then they write a check against that account, and they can basically use it as a free loan to themselves. It started back in 1978 when a man by the name of William Sullivan Jr., he called it an aggressive new cash management system. He explained it to his executives. They had a big team meeting at one point, and they had 9 of the regional office managers all there. And his plan was to extract substantial profits in interest income. Now, his motive was to give the whole company a leg up on the competition. And he took advantage of the fact that there really wasn't a clear regulation over this area of the financial industry. It was illegal, but it wasn't very well understood. And then over the next few years, it became rampant throughout E.F. Hutton's branches. Like many other cases that we've talked about this semester, it began small and then just kind of snowballed as those people that participated in the practice didn't see any consequences. So they became more and more bold with the amount that they floated, and ultimately they got tripped up by their own greed. So what happened? Basically, a small bank decided that something looked funny with the books because this huge financial institution was trying to get money from them that didn't really make sense, the amount that they were trying to get. So they reported it. And then the house of cards just kind of came falling down on E.F. Hutton. But this is where the culture at the organization really showed its vulnerabilities to being susceptible to something like this, because when confronted by the results of the investigation and the potential consequences, the executives basically just said, well, we'll have a week of bad press, but then we'll go back to normal. Well, what really happened was that the company ended up having to plead guilty to over 2,000 counts, felony counts of mail and wire fraud. They were ordered to pay about $2 million in fines. They had to put aside $8 million to pay back restitutions to the institutions that they defrauded. And there was this quote during the investigation where an article ran in the New York Times that basically said that, rather than closing the books on the episode, which is what they thought was going to happen, oh, we'll have a bad week of press and then we'll move on, the admission of guilt basically churned up a whole bunch of new inquiries by government agencies, and they ended up being investigated by the House Judiciary Committee, the Department of Justice, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Labor Department, and even the U.S. Attorney for President Jimmy Carter. So then during the investigation, the leadership of the company continued to try to downplay the illegal activity. They acknowledged that it was technically illegal, but they also claimed that the law was just kind of confusing and not well known. And they also said that the employees that were engaged in the activity didn't really understand that it was illegal or even against company policy. The company also was accused of using bullying tactics for those institutions that questioned them. So they would go on the offensive against companies that questioned any of their policies instead. According to a New York Times article on the investigation, hundreds of officers in the company were involved in the scheme. There was like 25 of them that acted as the kind of masterminds behind the practice. But what they did was they would regularly reward the bank managers that maximized interest income, going as far as like sending them envelopes of play money to dramatize what would happen, what kind of bonus they could get. They also gave them up to 10% of whatever interest income they were able to get. So they were incentivizing this behavior. Also found out later during the investigation that there were no controls in place to keep this kind of thing from happening, or even to just be discovered. The CFO and general counsel of the company actually resigned during the investigation because it was discovered that they hadn't really bothered to put any of that stuff in there. And a lot of that was due to the CEO of the time, a guy named Robert Foman. And while he wasn't implicated directly in the investigation, he created this culture where it was profit above all. And he was also considered a very autocratic leader. Like, you didn't cross this guy. And he actually said that he liked the aggressive reputation that they had. And he acknowledged that perhaps that could have contributed to the scandal. But just there were a lot of really sketchy things going on in the culture that leadership basically said was okay. And they would talk about it openly in meetings. They would incentivize the people that were doing the things well. And then after this, kind of a sidebar, they also found out that E.F. Hutton was laundering money for an organized crime family. So just a lot of really bad things going on in the culture of the organization. So the company ended up getting sold as a result of all this. About 2 years after the scandal, finally, they just couldn't keep it up anymore. So they were sold, and over the 30 years from 1987 to 2007, they didn't really exist. Well, back in 2007, the E.F. Hutton brand did get revived. And for the past 10 years, they've been working to kind of revive their reputation. They are absolutely diligent about maintaining their stringent ethical standards. They hyper focus on individual clients. They've been offering new online services to try to reach a new marketplace, and they've made concerted efforts to give back to their community and build up goodwill. They even moved out of Wall Street and then into Ohio to try to remove themselves literally from Wall Street and hopefully rebuild their brand. So we can only hope that they are incorporating their lessons from their mistakes of the past to prevent recurrence in the future. They say they've got the policies and controls in place to prevent that from happening. So the future will tell us if they've learned their lessons, but hopefully they're back in the game and they've learned their lessons, and so have all of we.